Okay, it's a pleasure to welcome everyone to the finale for our summer series of Pirkei Avot. We have been in service every Sunday evening, and I want to thank everyone for their participation, those who've been with us from the beginning and those who have dipped in and out in accordance with their scheduling or other considerations. So thank you for being part of our studies. And I'm looking forward, hopefully, to picking up where we left off next season after Pesach. Seems a long way away. Hopefully, the pattern will be a lot more conventional by that time than what we've had in the last 5 months or so. But anyway, we're up to Mishnah Zion, the seventh Mishnah in the second chapter. So Pirkei Avot, chapter 2, Mishnah 7. And I can't say it's entirely by design, maybe by just happenstance, but in any case, the Mishnah is very apt for the season, as you can probably see if you've glanced at it already in the few minute or so that I've been talking. You'll see it's a fairly somber topic, and that captures the sort of tempo of the time of year, of course, as we approach Tisha B'Av. So let's get started right away. He also saw a skull that was floating on the water. Now, who probably refers to Hillel, whose name was mentioned a few Mishnahs back, and presumably the last few teachings have derived from Hillel. So he also saw this skull that was floating al panei hamayim. Amar la, and he said to it, addressing this human skull, al da'ateft atfuch, because you drowned someone, you were drowned. V'sof metayfayech, and ultimately those who have drowned you, yitufun, they too will be drowned. So as I said, it's a bit somber, a bit morbid, reflecting on the I guess fragility of life, also the pattern, the sort of cycle of life, as we shall see. So the first observation I'd like to make is just that, the grisly discovery of a human skull floating in the water can be expected to elicit reflections on life and death, and to maybe speculate inevitably, maybe almost instinctively, on how it came about that this person was drowned, or at least his corpse was thrown into the water, and then over time the skull became separated from the rest of the body. And many have observed that Hillel is not the only one to be moved to those kinds of reflections faced with such a discovery. I'm thinking of one of the most famous passages in all of English literature, Shakespeare's Hamlet, where Hamlet himself sort of indulges in one of the most famous soliloquies in all of the English language. To be or not to be, this is the question, and he's kind of addressing the skull of his friend, a jester whom he once knew, and he is now faced with the evidence of his death. So just to say that we find elsewhere in literature as well. So this kind of prompts Hillel's musings, but to look at it much more deeply, and having, as I said, acknowledged the appropriateness of the season for this sort of reflection, many have asked, why does Hillel make the assumption that this evident victim of murder was himself a villain, that he himself had committed murder, and that's why he sort of got what was coming to him? And I saw, as I've mentioned in the past, that I like to consult the chapters written by Jeffrey Rubinoff and friends, published by ALTC a couple of years ago. So Jeffrey asks that, or he kind of makes the observation that he's troubled by this assumption that whoever suffers some misfortune had it coming to him, as if to say that no innocent person ever comes to disadvantage or to grief. Why then does Hillel make that assumption? Maybe this is a righteous or innocent man who tragically has suffered this terrible fate. Why does he presume that he was guilty? And so one of the Mefarshim actually quoted in Medrash Shmuel. We've mentioned Medrash Shmuel many times. Got it here on my desk. One of the most important and influential commentaries on Pirkei Avot. It's actually an anthology, including he references a vast array of earlier commentaries. He was a disciple of the Ari, by the way, so he lived in the 16th century. Actually, today is the Yortzeit of the Ari, so perhaps it's apropos that we mention a teaching from one of his distinguished circle. Anyway, Rav Shmuel de Uzida was his name. So he suggests possibly Hillel knew this person, meaning he was able to identify that this was indeed a righteous I'm sorry, the opposite. This was indeed a highwayman. He recognized him and he knew that he was himself, that this person was a criminal, was a murderer. And therefore, when he saw that he had been himself drowned, he was reflecting that he got his just deserts. Actually, Rashi alludes to this as well, to this suggestion that actually Hillel was able to state with confidence that indeed this person was a rogue, he was a villain, and he got what was coming to him. But nevertheless, he reflects on the fact that even though he got what was coming to him, because he murdered someone else, so he suffered the same fate, but those who have murdered him will also one day be called to account and they will suffer as well. But before I get to that, just want to mention a novel idea which I seem to recall seeing many years ago. I don't recall where, but when preparing for the Shiur today, I saw that Irving Bunim in his Ethics from Sinai, he suggests that maybe this whole Mishnah is a metaphor, that Hillel was sort of not so much imagining, but he couched a message in terms of seeing the evidence of someone who has committed a crime get his ultimate comeuppance, and acknowledging and recognizing that there is a kind of pattern in life. And the point here is that Hillel wanted to provide some reassurance, or at least some encouragement, to his fellow Jews who were suffering under the heavy boot of the Roman occupiers, who were persecuting the Jews mercilessly. And it was a way of saying that those villainous Romans who are oppressing us will one day pay the price as well, that they will not remain always in a position of dominance, in a position to persecute innocent people, but rather on the contrary, the time will come when they will also be called to account and they will pay the price. It's sort of in the spirit of Chad Gadya that we sing at the Seder night, at the very end of the Seder. If we actually connect our Pirkei Avos studies back to the very beginning, when we begin right after Pesach. So Chad Gad, at the end of the Seder, we recount the story, the parable of the kid worth 2 zuzim that was eaten by a cat, and the cat was bitten by a dog, and the dog was beaten by a stick, and the stick was burned by a fire, etc., which many of the Mefarshim understand as a metaphor for the cycle of history and the oppressors of the Jews, who one by one also are destroyed or are overwhelmed by another empire, a bit like the Chinese and the Americans, at least in the Chinese imagination. Time will tell. At any rate, I mean, this is certainly true of history. History works in cycles. So this is what Hillel has suggested. But yeah, I've just written in my notes, if you excuse my attempt at a bit of eloquence, that Hillel was saying that Old Man River will carry Rome out to sea and they will be gone forever. This is the idea of the skull floating on the water. Presumably it was a river that, the tides, the pattern of time will ultimately render Rome obsolete and will ultimately consign Rome to the dustbin of history, as we like to say. Okay, that's an interesting suggestion, which there may well be some truth to that. But taken at face value, it's clear that the message that Hillel is portraying here is the important lesson of midah keneged midah. I'm sure you've come across that expression, measure for measure. We have the idea that Hashem metes out punishment and indeed reward in a measure for measure manner. And that's why Hillel doesn't just say he heard or he saw that someone was killed and he said, well, probably he was a killer and his killers will also be ultimately killed as well. But rather he said that you must have drowned someone, and that's why you were drowned. And those who drowned you will themselves be drowned. The idea that Hashem, so to speak, pays close attention and ensures that justice is meted out in a precise fashion. Of course, the example of someone who's been drowned and the skull is floating down the river is a gruesome example of a very desperate or very contemptuous form of death, in which the victim is not even given the benefit of a burial, in which the body decomposes and separates one limb from another limb, and even the family members, the mourners, have no opportunity even to bury the deceased or to have mark his grave. He's gone without a trace. So this symbolizes a kind of like gruesome death, and it's associated therefore not with a natural death, not with a person who dies even like in a premature way, but in a violent death, a gruesome death. And probably, again, al der hapshat, just taking it as a sort of face value, it's reasonable for Hillel to have concluded that probably he was the victim of gang warfare. He himself was probably a highwayman or a criminal, and that's why he got what he deserved. And the Mefarshim, I think the Bartanura mentions the famous statement of the Gemara in Shabbos on Daf Lamed Beis, page 32a, that Megalgalin Zechus al Yidei Zakai Umegalgalin Chov al Yidei Chayav, that merit accrues to someone, that is to say, a beneficial action is carried out by someone who is meritorious, and a negative, a harmful, or a damaging action is brought about through the agency of someone who is himself guilty. I always mention, I know those who've heard me at Kesher over the years, I've mentioned in the past about the Texas politician who said about a rival, that scoundrel deserves to be kicked to death by a jackass and I'm just the guy to do it. This idea that some misfortune or some kind of tragic, violent event, even if it's part of the divine plan that it should happen, but it is brought about through the agency of someone who is himself guilty. So therefore, the person who drowned this victim will himself be drowned because he's no tzaddik. He is no innocent actor, and even if he's fulfilling the divine plan, but he himself will also pay the price, which is a deserved price as well. The Mefarshim I also saw mention maybe the paradigm for this, if you think back to the narrative in the book of Bereshis. So the first of the Avos, Avraham Avinu, was already informed by God that his descendants will be strangers in a foreign land and they will be oppressed for hundreds of years. And then Hashem says, "V'gam es hagoy asher ya'avodu dan anochi." But also the people whom they serve, I will judge. And the Mefarshim ask, Ramban quotes the Rambam and others, and they ask if it was already a prophetic destiny that the Jewish people, the descendants of Avram, would be oppressed in a foreign land, then why does Hashem say that he will judge and he will call to account those who oppress them? On the contrary, they are carrying out the divine will. So whatever the answers are, the essence of it is that the Egyptians did not act as a way like in response to the divine command. They oppressed the Jews, they exploited them, they enslaved them for their own reasons and for their own purposes. Someone to say, actually, I saw in Kerem Hatzvi, he's just like this, but really the others have the same kind of thought as well, that the Egyptians were deserving of punishment. Therefore, Hashem sent the descendants of Abraham to Mitzrayim, so that the Egyptians who were deserving of punishment would be the ones to oppress them, so that when the Jews leave Mitzrayim, they will leave Birchush Gadol with great wealth, and Hashem will punish the Egyptians for what they did originally, meaning because they were deserving of punishment. That's why Hashem brought it about that they were the ones, they were the nation to carry out this divine prophecy or divine instruction to oppress the Jewish people. It's not that they were necessarily punished for what they did to the Jewish people. They may have been guilty already for generations prior to that. So this is the idea that the two come together. So one of the Mefarshim, the Midrash Shmuel says, like, if a person is a victim of theft, so the fact that he's a victim of theft, that is because of the divine plan. That's divine providence. But the act of theft is because of the burglar. So the loss to the victim, that was part of God's plan. But the action and the criminal behavior on the part of the thief, that is the free will of the thief that he's exercised. And of course, he deserves to be called to account for that. I don't want to needlessly wander into politically sensitive areas, but just because it's timely, it's a little bit like George Floyd. You know, he was a career criminal. This person, a criminal whose death touched off the many riots and all of the Black Lives Matter, although it happened already a few years before, but the most recent wave, the terrible wave, was touched off because George Floyd was killed. Now, he was a career criminal. He had a rap sheet that reads like the world's leading anti-shidduch CV. I mean, if you read the account of his life and his career, he was a career criminal. And yet the officer who killed him, if indeed that's what happened, it seems to be the case, deserves to be prosecuted and deserves to be called to account for what he did. It's not for a police officer arresting someone to carry out vigilante justice in that way. So it's all here in our Mishnah. As I say, it has a very contemporary ring to it in that regard. The Mefarshim say there's something deeper here though as well. It's one thing to make the observation about midah keneged midah, measure for measure, and that probably someone who has been drowned, the likelihood is that he himself was as I've said in contemporary terms, he was a gangster and he may have been a victim of gang warfare or similar. But at the same time, we all know that there are innocent people who do drown, and there are innocent victims of violence, including some of the victims of the Black Lives Matter rioting as well. But again, I said I'm not going to get into politics. And therefore, this gives rise to the most ancient and classic philosophical challenge, and that is, how does the divine system of justice correlate with our perception and with our instinctive or even the Torah's own guidelines for earthly justice? Often we seem to confront the righteous who suffer, the wicked who flourish, and Hillel has seen a skull floating down the river, evidently the victim of foul play, and inevitably the question is inescapable. Is this right? Is this justice? So Hillel seems to say, yes, it is just because he was a murderer. He was murdered. Those who murdered him will also be drowned one day. So I saw several of the Mefarshim say that what Hillel is acknowledging here ultimately is that we can only see a snapshot of life. Even in a person's entire lifetime, if he lives in this world for 80 years, for 90 years, for 120 years, it's but a short interval in the full span of time. And therefore, recognizing that, he acknowledges that just as Moshe Rabbeinu, when he was confronted with the divine punishment or the divine decision that Moshe, would not allow the Jewish people, would not bring the Jewish people into the land of Israel, that Moshe would die in the wilderness, essentially together with the whole generation that perished wandering in the wilderness. So this is our parsha really, Va'eschanan, that I importuned God at that time, and yet the answer was no. So Moshe, Hitzdik alav sadin, towards the very end of the life of Moshe, maybe on the last day of his life, he said the words, Hatzur tamim pa'alo, the rock, all of his whose ways are perfect. Hatzur tamim pa'alo. In other words, Moshe acknowledged, even though perhaps he didn't understand it, and he didn't maybe agree with the divine command. And certainly when Moshe asked Hashem generally to explain why it is that the righteous sometimes suffer and the wicked seem to flourish at times, and Hashem said, no one can understand that while he is yet alive, Moshe acknowledged indeed that is the case. Essentially, this is what Hillel is saying as well, that it may be beyond our purview of vision. What we see, what we witness, what we experience may be limited to the point that we don't observe the rectification, we don't observe the sort of repayment or the quid quo pro or pro quo that we would like to see. But he acknowledges that nevertheless Hashem does have a plan, although it may not be revealed to us, and generally is not revealed to us. I would like to read a kind of midrashic, if you like, illustration of this, a parable maybe. Excuse me. Which illustrates this idea. You have to listen closely, and this medrash does not rely on the idea of reincarnation, but simply seeing the full picture, which an individual rarely has the opportunity of observing. So I'll just read you a little midrashic passage. If I have found favor in your eyes, my God, show me your ways. So this is what Moshe said, if you recall, in the aftermath of the Chet HaEgel. In this verse, according to the Medrash, Moses asked God to explain divine justice to him. The Medrash relates that in response, God said that he would show Moses two incidents of divine justice. In the first scene shown to Moshe, a soldier dismounts from his horse to have a drink at a small pond. As he gets back on his horse, he drops a bag of money without realizing it. The soldier rides off, and a teenage boy walking by sees the money pouch, picks it up, and walks away. Later, an old man lies down by the pond to sleep. The soldier, who has now realized that he has lost his money, returns to the pond and sees the old man there. He asks the man where his money is, and the old man claims not to know. The soldier then draws his sword and kills the man in anger. God said to Moshe, see, perfect justice. Obviously, Moshe does not understand, so Hashem showed him yet another incident. Here's the second scene. A young boy and his father are walking along a path in a forest. Suddenly, a bandit attacks them, knocking the father unconscious and taking his money. A young military cadet observes the scene from behind some bushes where he has been resting, but he does not do anything until he sees the outcome of the attack. As the bandit is about to escape, the cadet jumps out with his sword, scaring the bandit, who drops the money and runs away. The cadet picks up the money and rides away, leaving the boy crying with his unconscious father lying nearby. Again, God said to Moshe, see, perfect justice. And again, Moshe did not understand. Then Hashem told Moshe that in fact, the second scene that he was shown occurred before the first. Here's where it gets complicated. The bandit of the second story is the old man in the first who is killed by the soldier. The cadet who took the boy's money in the second story and did not intervene to prevent the robbery is the soldier who loses the money and kills the bandit, who is now an old man, in the first story. The teenager who finds the money in the first story is the child of the second story. Now that Moshe was able to see the complete picture, he was able to understand divine justice. Now, this is just a medrash, it's a parable, but it illustrates how if a person if we in our own lives see an event or even a sequence of events, at the same time, we inevitably have to realize it's only a small portion. It's only a small, glimpse of the whole story. There's a great baseball metaphor, but I'll spare you it, because if you don't understand baseball, then you won't understand the metaphor either. I'll be happy to tell you for the sake of Carl, but anyway, I'll spare you that. In any case, I'm sure that you get the idea. And this is what Hillel is affirming, that even though he cannot say with certainty from his own experience, of his own knowledge, that this skull was a bandit and a highwayman, and he was a murderer, and then he was drowned, etc., but metaphorically, Hillel says, this is how Hashem runs his world. We cannot always understand it. Actually, if you look closely again at the Mishnah, I hope you have the Mishnah in front of you. Take a look what Hillel said. Al da'ateft atfuch. By the way, we'll explain why it's in Aramaic as well. That's still to come. Al da'ataft atfuch, because you drowned someone, you were drowned. V'sof metayfayich yitufun. And in the end, v'sof. So Medrash Shmuel says the word v'sof, in the end, it does not only mean like necessarily eventually whoever was responsible for drowning you will also be drowned, but it could mean, he suggests, in another Gilgul, even in another reincarnation. It's possible that the accounts cannot be settled within the lifetime of the actors themselves, but ultimately only in a future life, in the Sod HaGilgul, the concept of reincarnation. And he says, because actually, we know there are murderers who die a peaceful death on their own beds. Not every murderer is himself brought to justice or even killed by another gangster. In some cases, they do live out their lives. I don't think we quite have time, but some of you may recall the story of Rav Aaron Kotler and the mafiosi that we've told in the past. If we have time, I'll tell you that story in the end as well. It is tangentially related. Rav Aaron Kotler had once an opportunity to get to know a certain mafioso. His name is, I don't recall, but it's a registered story. The personalities are actually historical figures. If there's time, we'll tell it at the end. Now, Kerem HaTzvi, Rav Tzvi Hirsch-Farber, does not disappoint in a very novel interpretation here. Take a look at the very beginning of our Mishnah. Afhu ra'ah, afhu, the word af means he also. It could have simply said hu ra'ah or hu gam ra'ah. Afhu ra'ah means he also saw, in addition to maybe someone else who saw, he also saw. Hillel also saw a skull. So it's completely unclear. I mean, it's obscure in the Mishnah itself why it says the word af. Of course, al derech hapshat, it just means that we've recorded a number of profound and compelling and insightful teachings of Hillel. And now the Mishnah is saying one last thing from Hillel, one last experience of Hillel, or a saying of Hillel that was evinced by particular experience, was that he saw a skull, etc. But maybe afhu ra'ah means he also, and there's someone else as well. There's someone else as well. There is a man in the Talmud who is called someone else. And one of the limitations of the Zoom experience is I can't see in front of me who is actually here. But those who have quite a lot of experience in the study of Talmud will know what I'm referring to. There is a man who is known as someone else. He's known as Acher, the other one. He had a name. His real name was Elisha ben Avuya, and he was one of the sages of the Talmud, one of the great men of the Talmud, who became a heretic. And because he became a heretic, and he ultimately was one who mocked the rabbis and who mocked the Torah as well, so the Talmud generally does not refer to him by name. They call him Acher, someone else. What happened with someone else, this Acher? So the Talmud, at the very end of Tractate Chulin, page 142, the Talmud there relates that this is also so apt for these days of the year. Acher saw the head of Rav Chutzpis Hamaturgaman, and he saw his tongue, and his tongue was languishing in the dung heap. And he said, the tongue, the mouth that spoke such pearls of wisdom. His name was Chutzpis Hamaturgaman. Maturgaman means, in modern Hebrew, Maturgaman and Metargem is a translator. But in Talmudic usage, Maturgaman was an orator. He was like a spokesman, and he was eloquent. He was a person who brought the Talmudic or the rabbinic or the midrashic teachings to life with his eloquence, with his compelling style. He was like what we would call today a magid. He was renowned for his wisdom and for his gift of speech. And now this person who was so righteous, he was among the Asara Haruge Malchus, among the 10 sages who were put to death by the Roman authorities. And we read about their death on Tisha B'Av. It may not be among the keynotes we're going to say, actually, because the we don't have time to say them all this year. But in any case, we say it on Yom Kippur as well. Another version of that story. In any case, the point is that Acher also saw the example of the skull of someone who had died. Says Kerem Hatzvi, maybe Hillel recognized the skull of this man who was a righteous man. Maybe contrary to what we've said so far, he knew or he presumed that he was a highwayman, he was a villain. Maybe on the contrary, Hillel saw he was righteous, and nevertheless, Hillel was matzdik alav es hadin. Hillel said, look, it's part of the divine plan. It's not within my ability or anyone's ability, even that of Moshe Rabbeinu himself, to understand or to fully justify in his own mind, but this is part of the divine plan. So maybe that's why it says Afhu. The intent is to compare, maybe to contrast Hillel's response to that of Acher, of the man who's known as Acher, of someone else, Elisha ben Avuya. I'd like to now share with you, I'm smiling because it's a beautiful drash. I find it difficult to believe it's the Pashut Pshat in the Mishnah, but because all of the other approaches more or less revolve around the same recognition, the same theme as we have developed it, here's one that's completely different. This is from Rabbi David Pinto, and he asks two simple questions, very obvious questions. This Mishnah is in Aramaic. The Mishnah generally, the Mishnah as opposed to the Talmud, the Gemara is generally in Aramaic. The Mishnah, with only a few exceptions, is in Hebrew. The Mishnah is in Hebrew. Certainly Pirkei Avot, we've seen week by week, Mishnah one after another, they're all in Hebrew. That's why there's sometimes a few occasional like Aramaic influenced expressions, but the general theme of the Mishnah is all written in Hebrew. This is in Aramaic, though. So he says, why is this written in Aramaic? And also, what's the significance of Tsafa al Panei Hamayim? Why does Hillel, or the Mishnah, report that Hillel saw a skull floating on the water? You could say he found it by the seashore or something else like that. Tsafa al Panei Hamayim, floating. He has the following suggestion. The Medrash says, Hakol kol Yaakov V'hayadayim yedei Esav. That's what Yitzchak said in surprise when he was confronted with someone whom he was told is Esav, but he sounded like Yaakov, but he felt like Esav. Remember, Yitzchak's eyes were failing, and Yaakov, at his mother's urging, was impersonating his brother, and therefore Yitzchak was unsure, he was ambivalent, and he said, the voice is the voice of Yaakov, the hands are the hands of Esav. And the rabbis see in this a kind of formula that when the voice is that of Yaakov, when the Jewish people are engaged in using their voice for the purpose of the study of Torah and for tefillah, for prayer, then we are spared the heavy hand of Esav. But if there is no Kol Yaakov, then we are confronted by the Yadayim Yadei Esav, the heavy and the violent hands of Esav. Says a medrash that as long as we have the tziftzuf, now the word tziftzuf is in modern Hebrew, tziftzuf is like an alarm or something similar. In classical Hebrew, medieval Hebrew, tziftzuf is the sound of the birds chirping. It sounds a bit like chirping. It probably is onomatopoeic, in fact, tziftzuf. But we also find the word tziftzuf as referring to the sound of the study of Torah. It has a kind of lilting quality to it. Anyone who has been to a beis medrash, a traditional beis medrash where the Torah is studied in chavrusas, there's a certain traditional lilt. I'm not saying it's the most melodious, but there's a certain chant, there's a certain strong quality to the sound of Torah study. Says the medrash that a person, there once was a student, and he studied the Torah, but not out loud. He did it balachash, silently. He was just reading maybe with his eyes, and he wasn't maybe even moving his lips. He was not articulating it, and he certainly wasn't singing it. So the Medrash says that some years passed, and before long he forgot his learning altogether. And he was sort of blamed for his own forgetfulness because he chose not to study the Torah in the classic way. And because he was silent in his study, therefore he forgot the Torah. So Rabbi Pinto says maybe that's what Hillel saw here. Tsafa is Lashon tziftzuf. Tziftzuf, like we say, to chirp, the sound of Torah study. Al panei hamayim, on the surface of the water, ein mayim ela Torah. That mayim is a metaphor for the Torah itself. It says al da'ataft. So he says the word da'ataft is to drown in Aramaic. But it's related, he suggests, to the word atum. Atum means sealed. For those who remember back to the first Gulf War in 1991, I think it was, the first Gulf War, so they had what was known as a cheder atum, the sealed rooms. That word came to prominence at that time. Anyway, atum means sealed. His lips were sealed. He, as I said, just read it with his eyes. He didn't move his lips. He didn't articulate. He didn't give voice to the sound of the study of Torah. So Hillel was saying that you've met your end because you didn't study Torah properly. You studied it maybe half-heartedly, or I'd like to explain it further in one moment. And therefore, that's why you've drowned. And the ones who have drowned you, meaning the ones from whom you learned to study silently, maybe there are other boys in the beis medrash, other men in your circle, and you learned from them. You followed their example because they were responsible for modeling this negative behavior. They'll also pay the price eventually as well. So this is Rabbi Pinto's midrashic interpretation of the Mishnah. I would like to add on a little bit, though, to this as well. Maybe when it says that he didn't learn out loud, it means that he didn't learn b'chavrusa. If I'm learning with a partner, I've got to learn out loud. I can't learn together with him if we don't communicate with one another. That's obvious. Shnaim sheyashu ve'ein b'neihem divrei Torah. Two people who sit together for the study of Torah. So if I have a chavrusa, of course I've got to speak out loud. I've got to learn out loud. So if this person was learning on his own, if he was learning silently, probably he was learning on his own. Now, it's true that a person, even who's learning on his own, can also learn out loud, and many people do. Many times I've walked into a beis medrash, maybe it's quiet, there are only a few people there. There may be someone who's learning out loud, and it's not that he's talking to himself, but I guess in a way he is talking to himself. But the learning is conducted in that kind of participatory fashion. It's not just an intellectual pursuit. It's not just a process of intellectual edification, but it's a process that involves the entire consciousness of a person. It penetrates not only his intellectual ability, but it engages and uplifts his spirit as well. You could think of this as the difference between a base medrash and a library. If anyone has ever entered a traditional base medrash, especially if it's busy, it's very loud. It's almost like a train station. It's so loud that sometimes it's hard to even hear yourself think, or even to learn with a chavrusa is hard. You've got to talk. So sometimes if my voice is weak for whatever the reason, I learn in another room with my chavrusa because there's too much noise in the base medrash. Otherwise, I just contribute to the noise. When one goes into a library, certainly a traditional library, which I don't know if they exist anymore, hardly, it's quiet, they've got signs, there's a library. So that distinction, and I'm not saying you can't learn Torah in a library, or you can't study a mathematics book in the base medrash, but the purpose of a library is for study. The purpose of a base medrash is for learning. Now, I'm not claiming that the meaning of the word study and learn is exactly the way I'd like to characterize it, but I do believe it hints to this idea. When I study something, I would like to understand the text. I would like to analyze the text. I would like to apply my wisdom, such as it is, to the text, to maybe evaluate the text. But when I learn something, when I learn Torah, I want the Torah to penetrate me. I'm not looking to evaluate the text. I want the text to evaluate me. It's not just a process that I am sort of separate from that which I am studying, but rather when I learn Torah, the Torah becomes part of me. So maybe this student who learned Torah, but only as an intellectual enterprise, the fact that he didn't speak it or he didn't sing it means that his relationship with the Torah was flawed. And one of my personal heroes in Jewish history is Rabbi Yisrael Salant. I say personal, not that I have any kind of connection to him in terms of emulating him, halavai that I would. But that is an example of someone whose contribution to the Jewish world is absolutely profound in my view. Rabbi Yisrael Salanter was the father of the Musar movement. And he taught the idea of Musar bihislahavus, the study of Musar in a way that was, bihislahavus means with fire, with passion, that he said in many times people who study Musar texts, if they're only using that word study it, and they don't engage with it, they don't allow the text of the Torah to animate them, to make them a different person, so that kind of Torah learning is flawed. I'd just like to end finally with a positive idea. Maybe we'll still have time for the mafiosi as well. The theme of our Mishnah is what goes around comes around. And of course, Hillel has described it, or is articulating this thought in a grisly way when he comes across a skull, and he refers to drowning and more drowning and further drowning, murder and more murder. I would like, and as I mentioned previously, actually in another Mishnah, probably the negative is a more striking way to convey this idea. But I would like to end by saying the same idea definitely exists in the positive. Mida keneged mida, measure for measure, is in the positive as well. It's not only in terms of suffering or misfortune, or someone who wrongs another person will himself suffer as well. It happens in the positive also. There's an example which I know I've mentioned in the past, and I just want to mention again. To me, this is a very moving and very satisfying example of this idea. There was a young man that Ruthie and I think we could say that we drew him near. We were makarev him in a number of ways. He became a very frequent guest in our house. He was like a ben bias, as we say. And although he came from a very secular Jewish family, but he became a Baal Tshuva in a very inspiring way. And he got married, and he lived in London after he was married for a short while, and then he moved to Israel. And we're still in touch with him. This goes back probably 28 years when we first met him, approximately, maybe more, 28, 29 years. We've lived in London for actually now coming on to 31 years. In any case, we've known him a long time. We're still in touch with him and his wife and his kids. In fact, not long ago, Ruthie and I went to Israel for his daughter's wedding. But all of our children when they were in Israel, and each of our 5 children has gone to Israel to study for a few years, and each of them, without exception, were guests in his home, for him and his wife and his children, on many occasions, and they've reached out to our children and to Ruthie and me in so many ways. And whenever I thank them for their kindness, for the hospitality, he always says, Rabbi Simon, this is nothing compared to what you did for me. You know, you have given me everything that I have Jewishly. So whatever I can give back, it's only a pleasure. Now, I don't want to evaluate who did more for whom, but it illustrates the idea that even though I could give you a lot of examples of people maybe we've helped who we haven't possibly kept in touch with, haven't heard from them, but maybe they've helped someone else. Maybe they have helped another person, and that has nothing to do with me or my family, but they've helped someone else. And there's a virtuous circle as well. So although Hillel has expressed this idea in a striking way, this notion of measure for measure and the cycle of life. But the word gulgoles comes from the word galgal, a wheel as well. That this is the galgal hachozer ba'olam, something, a pattern which repeats itself. Okay, it's just about time for Mariv, and we finished on time as well, which is very nice. But maybe I'll just take another minute for the story of Rav Aaron Cutler and Joe Bonono, who was the mafiosi. So actually, Irving Bunim had a hand in this story. Irving Bunim was a businessman. He was an activist. He was a successful businessman. He was a very learned person, and he was an expert in Pirkei Avos. And I've quoted him consistently, probably every week during our series. But he was also an outstanding Mokir Rabbanim. He had great respect, great reverence, and veneration for the greatest rabbis of his time, and he knew all of them, certainly those who came to America. In particular, of Aaron Cutler. And on one occasion, just tell the story, the essence of the story without the details, which I can't recall exactly. There were a number of Jews who were in Sicily during the Holocaust years. They escaped maybe from Italy or through Italy, and they were in Sicily, and they essentially were trapped there. And of course, Mussolini was an ally of Hitler, and the possibility of extricating them from Sicily was very remote. So they made some inquiries. Is there anyone in America who has some kind of behind the scenes influence in Sicily? It didn't take long to make their way to the home of a mafiosi who was called Joe Bonono. And basically, essentially, they did a deal with him. And he was I don't know how religious man we could say that a mafiosi was, but in any case, he came from a religious background, and he respected Rav Aaron Cutler, who was the greatest rabbi of the generation, he was told. So he said, Rabbi, what will you give me? I don't know whether it's a matter of money or blessing. And he wanted a blessing from the rabbi. And actually, he did help. He did help to rescue these Jewish people. So he wanted a blessing from the rabbi. So if Aaron Cutler was in an awkward position, what kind of blessing does he give to mafiosi? That he should flourish in his work, that he should succeed in, killing off his enemies. And he said, I give you a blessing that you should live to an old age and you should die in your bed. And he did. He actually retired not long after, retired from the active crime, and he moved to Arizona, and he died, I think, at the age of 89 or so, quite some years later. And he lived out in a quiet retirement, and he died in his death. Actually, there's a postscript to the story that some years later, Rav Aaron Cutler died in 1962, and some years he was succeeded by his son Rav Shneur Cutler. Some years later, a big black limousine pulled up outside of Lakewood Yeshiva, and a few tough-looking guys walked out, and they were asking for Rabbi Cutler. So they showed him into the Rosh Yeshiva's office, but it was the son. So he said, no, we're looking for an older man. So he said, well, that was my father. He's passed away. So anyway, they wanted a blessing from him as well. So he said, no, my father was very great. I'm not that great. I don't think I can help you. And anyway, they went away. So that is the story of Rav Aaron Cutler and the mafiosi. So in certain lines of business, the best a person can hope for is to die in his own bed. In any case, Hillel said that generally speaking, a person who is murderer will ultimately pay the price himself. But again, to end on the positive note, the same idea no doubt is true in a positive way as well. Sometimes we're able to see it or experiencing it, or experience it, other times perhaps not. But this is how Hashem runs the world, and this is the teaching of the Mishnah. I wish everyone a wonderful week. Shavua Tov, notwithstanding the fast of Tisha B'Av, it should be a meaningful fast, not a difficult fast, and should be soon transformed into a day of joy and celebration for all of Klal Yisrael. Thank you very much.
Yeah.